And the fossil layers seem to support some aspects of that, whereas evolutionists say the fossil record seems to support evolution. So let's take a look at those things as we hand things over to our local hosts again. Thanks for coming.
All right, good evening, good evening. We're glad you're back with us again as we continue to look at the evidence for creation. And today we're actually be looking at the evidence for the flood because it is connected in the sense that, as you will see, they use some of the evidence that really is for the flood to argue for evolution, okay? And so today we'll be studying the origins of the oceans, which is really about the evidence for the flood, okay? So, of course, the flood, a lot of people have a problem with flood, and if you go to academia, a lot of places, and you say you believe in the flood, you're actually looked at as ignorant. Really? You believe that kind of myth? You know, they're insulting of it, okay? But what we're going to show you today is that really the evidence is more overwhelming to demonstrate the flood than anything else, okay? And of course, the Bible says the earth was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. So God looked upon the earth, and indeed it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And God said to Noah, "The end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them." Right? And so the key things there is, right, that the earth was corrupt. And again, notice how that word is used often. And corrupt is associated with violence, right? Being violent, okay? And so God decides to bring the flood, right? And of course, the world that we have today should be the result of that flood. If you haven't been to in Kentucky, it is the Noah's Ark. Who's been there? Anybody? Okay. If you haven't, you need to go, right? So the Noah's Ark there is built to the scale that we get from the Bible, and we'll talk about that. This is the actually opening ceremonies, the inauguration of the Ark. And so, and again, it's not that far of a drive, maybe like 2.5 hour drive, maybe 3 to get there. Probably more like 3, right? And it's a very interesting because you can learn a whole lot about how this is all possible, a lot of details in there. So I encourage you to do that. What's really interesting, and again, there's lots of evidence to demonstrate about the flood. And one of the things, I talked about how they ridicule people who believe in the flood. You know, come on, that's a myth, that's crazy, it's fantastical. But yet if you listen to a lot of astronomers and stuff who study Mars, you know what they'll tell you? That all of Mars was once covered with water. So it's okay for Mars to be once covered in water and shaped by water, but then, no, you can't have that on the Earth, right? Whereas in Mars, how much water is there now? None that we can see. They're trying to find water, none. And yet, how much water is there on our planet? Lots, right? Okay. Now, another interesting thing about that's fascinating is how many cultures around the world have flood story, right? So one of them is the Gilgamesh epic, but a lot of these stories have a lot of key factors in common. One, that there was a flood, that there was a small group or family that survived, that it was a judgment from God, okay? And these stories are found around the world. I mean, how does that happen, right? That you have these stories that are taking place. And so you have it in the Bible, you have the Babylonians, the Egyptians, you have a lot of Middle Eastern countries that have some form of this flood story. But it's not just Middle Eastern countries, okay? You have them also in what would be now European countries, right? Romans, Greek flood stories, okay? You have them in Africa with its flood stories. Even pygmies have a flood story in their history that they retell, okay? But it's not just there. Asian countries have flood stories. Pacific Islands, Australia have flood stories. And what's interesting is that even Native American tribes have flood stories. And of course, in those African, this is before exposure by missionaries or Christians, okay? That they have these stories. How in the world do you have so many cultures, so many diverse cultures from around the world have a flood story? And again, the idea of overall destruction from God, only a few survived, is the common elements. How does that happen if it's not because they have a shared story? Right? We have no evidence of these cultures communicating with each other, but they have this. So that in itself is evidence for the flood, okay? And so there's, like I said, there's lots of similarities in there, but there are some big differences, okay? So I don't want to say there's not differences, there are, but there are very key foundational similarities between these stories that we have. In Genesis, it says, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. Okay? Sorry, got it. Oh, come on. Cooperate. Okay. Was in the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters, right? So what do we know? The earth was filled, according to the creation story, the earth was filled with water. There was nothing but water, okay? And of course, right, to this day, we see water all over the place, right? And in the flood story, it says that the fountains of the deep broke open, okay? Now, exactly what that means, we don't know, but fountains of the deep, water underneath, right? Could be also volcanoes that erupted, right? And so for many years, this view of our earth is what was understood by most people. And again, it goes back to our first night, the origin of the debate. Right? It is the introduction of evolution and Darwinism that starts taking hold that people begin to change how they interpreted what they saw. Okay? And so in academia, you went from the majority of the people viewing this, and as a rise of humanism, the rise of and decline of Christianity and Darwinism, that people began to switch their understanding of what we see. It goes back to the idea of our first night, glasses, right? How you see and interpret the data makes a difference, okay? James Hutton, he's called the father of modern geology, and he postulated that, right? The way we look at the world today, the things that are happening now, the conditions, the processes that are happening now are the same ones that happened in the past, that there's nothing different. So an example of that would be is, of a river is taking sediment out, and you can calculate how much sediment is taken. You can use that to calculate how long it would have taken for that river to dig down and make the channel that it is, right? That's uniformitarianism. Nothing really drastic or different has happened. What's happening today is the same that's happened before, okay? So the Earth's surface has been altered only by currently observable processes, right? That was the idea of uniformitarianism. That became the most prominent view of people, how they looked at the world, okay? And so they looked at the Grand Canyon, okay? Sorry, I meant to turn that off. All right. Come on. Okay. All right, so the Grand Canyon, right, you see the idea of it got eroded by the Colorado River, right? That's what the uniformitarians would say, right? Calculated how much sediment goes out, how long it would have taken them to move all that dirt, okay? That's the idea of uniformitarianism. That was not the view until he brought it about, okay? So this is because the standard understanding of the Earth's history for centuries was that it wasn't uniformitarianism. Now, what's interesting, and then this gentleman, this geologist, Harlan Bretz, he started looking at the dry falls there in the Oregon area. And when he's looked at them carefully, and you probably can't see it very well in the picture, but you see this right here? Okay? If you look at it, you can see it well. If you look it up sometime, it looks like the Niagara Falls, but there's no water coming down. And so he started looking at that and started looking at it and studying it and thinking about and calculating, looking informations and researching and studying it. He says, there's no way that the modern processes happening now could have done this. Okay? So how did that happen? Of course, he started presenting that, but because the understood idea is uniformitarianism, right? Nothing has changed, everything is the same. They didn't believe him, so he continued to study and continued to research. He started putting his information together. And then, of course, he demonstrated and he started putting together information that there was probably an ice dam, that at some point that ice dam broke, and you have a rush of water coming down that created those dry falls. All right? And that's how we have them today. And so, even though he was not postulating that this was Noah's flood, we know that there was an ice age after Noah's flood. And so it's very possible that water got captured, and then when that ice dam broke, it created that catastrophic damage. And so it was a catastrophe. And actually, as time has gone by, there's so much research that today, uniformitarianism is not the idea that's always held in belief. There's plenty of evidence of catastrophism. They just don't want to say it was one big flood. Okay? They still won't admit that. Okay? And of course, you go to the Grand Canyon, you can see all the erosion. It says, oh, that happened over a little bit of time? Or was it a whole bunch of water that washed it out at first? Okay? And then the river was left over because it left an area for the water to run. And the thing is we have observable evidence of how quickly things can change. All right, can you see what that is? That is what? Mount St. Helens, right? Okay, I think probably most of us here, except for the little ones back there, right? Remember when that went off, right? Okay, and of course it exploded, shot off a huge section of the mountain. It had heat, ash, all kinds of stuff. And of course, they learned a lot of things. And what did that create? Okay, in just a matter of days, created what is called the Little Grand Canyon. Obviously, it's not as big, but it's pretty tall. It's taller than this building. And if you look, right, you see this? See how there's nice, like, layers. Smooth layers, okay? All of this was done in a matter of a few days. A few days that was laid. And then, and actually maybe even faster, actually the eroding of the canyon, because first all that deposit from that volcano came down, was layer down, layer down, layer down, layer down. And then there was a mud flow, if I remember correctly, that mud flow came and took out some of that sediment, and that's what you have here today. And again, this is we're not talking about, the developing of the layers was days, the mud flow was like in one day. They carved out the channel. So we have observable evidence of how this can happen in a short period of time. Right? And again, those are pointing out. You can look carefully. They're hard to see, but they look just like the layers. Right? If you go back to, you look at the Grand Canyon, right? You've got layers. And we know this everywhere. When you're driving down the highway and they cut out the mountain, what do you see? Layers, right? You go hiking in the Smokies, what do you see? Layers, okay? All across. So here's a very good example of those layers, okay? And so different material, different colors, okay? One of the things I'll mention again later, but what do you notice about those layers, okay? All right. Notice that the lines are very sharp and clean, right? Now, the idea of uniformitarianism or the Earth millions of years is that these layers were laid out over long periods of time, then another layer long periods of time, another long periods of time. What's the problem with that when you have nice, clean lines in between each layer? There's no erosion. There's no evidence of critters, right? I mean, if you've ever been anywhere and you have put something out, what happens? Plants, trees, critters start digging and boring holes. No evidence of that. It's a clear, definitive line. There's no way that would have happened if that layer would have been laid down and then millions of years pass by before the next layer goes on. Okay? Monument Valley. Okay? How did that take place? Well, if you imagine that was all, this whole valley, this valley was actually filled with dirt, with sediment, and got washed out, and then just these little areas, for some reasons, survived and got left behind. Okay? So all of these can easily be demonstrated to demonstrate how large amount of water could have moved all of that material out and left the things we see today. I remember hiking at Big South Fork. And if you go hiking anywhere and you start looking at the stones and you see how they're shaped, you can see that it was deposited by water. Okay? Everybody knows that it was deposited by water. And you say, how? And you go to the arches there. How did that arch form? If you look carefully, the arch is in like a peninsula. So what happens if lots of water was moving out, there could have been a weak area underneath that arch that washed out the arch underneath as it tried to, instead of making a big turnaround, it found the weak spot and the ridge, and so washed the water underneath, creating that natural arch. Okay? Again, easy to demonstrate. Now, check this out. If I were to get a rock, and if I was strong enough, and I went to bend it, what's going to happen to the rock? It's going to break, right? It's going to snap, right? Okay? If I have a concrete, and I try to bend the concrete, like a concrete slab, and you try to bend it, what's going to happen to that concrete? It's going to crack, right? It's not going to, nice turn. How do you get this wavy stuff? If this happened over millions of years, how do you get the rock to turn like that? And this is found all over the place. All over the place. Okay? How does that happen? Well, I'll just give you a simple illustration. If you're building a house and you're wanting to build like an entranceway out of concrete, how do you get the concrete to be shaped as a semicircle? What do you have to do? You form it when it's wet, right? Before it has hardened, right? That's the only way you're going to be able to shape it. But see, here you have all these layers, right? So what do we know is that these things had to be bent before they were turned into solid rock, right? So after the flood, you had the tectonic plates that moved things quickly. And after laying all these things down, they started pushing things. That's how we get the mountains. That's how we get these unusual shapes. And they're smooth. Those lines are smooth. Okay, why? Because the deposits weren't hard yet. They were still soft. Okay? So basically it comes down to, right? When we look at what's happening, either it was much water with little time, or as little water with much time. And just, again, we don't have to be scientists. What makes the most sense of what you see is that it was much water, short period of time. It's the most logical approach. Now I'm going to pause here for a second and let you know. We talk about the evidence for creation, the evidence for the flood. I've never said that there's proof, right? There are things that we don't understand how they happened. It's just that what we have makes better sense of it being much water, little period of time, than a little water and much time, okay? So it all depends how we choose to look at it. We're going to look at it as catastrophism, like one catastrophe that happened and things are different. All right? And of course, we know that's what happened. What happened here in North Carolina? That tragedy, right? It took one day to utterly destroy and change the riverbed, okay? And this was just a local flood, not a worldwide flood. So we know that catastrophes can do a lot of things to change the face of our planet. I mean, we witnessed that in our lifetime, okay? It only makes sense, okay? So there are actually only three types of rocks, as we talk about this, that we have. The first rock is sedimentary rock. That's pretty much all of the Grand Canyon, right? What is sedimentary rock? It's lime, sandstone, shale, coal, things that were deposited with water. And they'll tell you, yeah, we know, yeah, all that was deposited with water. They just say it was deposited over millions of years, okay? So sedimentary rock, and that's like 70% of everything you see is sedimentary rock. Igneous rock is things like granite, quartz, basalt. Basically, they're made from a lot of heat. Okay? So basalt is lava rock. Right? So when a volcano spews out lava and it dries, that's basalt. Okay? And then a metamorphic rock is like marble, slate, quartz, which is sedimentary rock, but has been put under a lot of heat and pressure. Okay? Limestone doesn't have as much the high heat component. Metamorphic does, right? So those are the three main types of rocks that we find in the world. The majority of them is sedimentary and they're formed by water. Okay? And again, if you're ever out in nature and you start hiking and looking at the rocks that you're on, you can see like the wave lines in the rocks have just been dried in place. Okay? So from the evolutionary perspective, right? We know what the Bible says, but from an evolutionary perspective, what is their Bible, right? What's their view when it comes to why they don't believe the flood? And that is the geologic column. And they say, oh, look at this. This clearly shows how things progressed in evolution, right? All right? And as you go up through this, right, the animals get bigger, and that's the case, right? As you go up the geologic column, the animals get bigger. And so they say here's a period of time in millions of years, okay? All right? And so each of these layers, that's the geologic column. And to them, is like their biggest evidence for the millions of years and their evolution and all this other kind of stuff, okay? The challenge is that pretty much all complex life shows up here in Cambrian. And those in the field call it the Cambrian explosion because all of a sudden, all kinds of life start showing up. Okay? And right here, the way they classify body types, right? So, we have a body type, lions have a body type, insects have a body type, birds have a body type, reptiles have, there's different types of body types that exist in life, okay? And what happens is out of the 35 different phyla, that's the scientific classification of the different types of body types, 32 of them show up all of a sudden fully formed in the Cambrian explosion. How does that happen? There's no evidence that before that you don't have them. All of a sudden, boom, there's like lots of life and all different kinds of life. Right? So even though they say, oh, look, the geologic column, the thing is life all of a sudden shows up out of nowhere. There's no evidence of it going up, right? So trilobites, right? Have you heard of trilobites? Trilobites, okay? Those are the little bugs that you see a whole bunch of them in a fossil record. The challenge that they call the trouble with trilobites is that these are complex animals with complex eyes. Eyes are one of the most advanced things in the body. And yet, all of a sudden, when they find a trilobite, he's fully formed. He has complex eyes, has all these different body parts. All of a sudden, it shows up. Ariel Roth said, scientists commonly refer to this abrupt transition as the Cambrian explosion, depending on the classification scheme used, about 30 to 40 or more animal phyla. The major categories of the animal kingdom appear in this part of the geologic column, right at the beginning, all of a sudden fully formed. Okay? And so that's, as we mentioned, the Cambrian explosion. Few or no new basic types show above this level. This sudden appearance challenges any idea of a long, gradual evolutionary process. Now, the animals are bigger, but understand it's like you have them in smaller form, but you have that body type already there. Okay? You just have the smaller animals. And most of them are ocean-dwelling, sea-dwelling, okay? In there, right? Stephen Jay Gould, evolutionary scientist, the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persist as a what? Trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, not the evidence of fossils. All right, so this is a scientist who is honest with the data and basically tells you all the stuff you see in textbooks, in scientific textbooks about the Darwin's tree of life, right? And in your book, there's this picture in there, right? Darwin's tree of life, the idea that all life started from there, right? Now, last week we saw how difficult it would be for life to start, and I kind of showed you a short little video that talked about the complexity at the beginning here of just the protein parts of a cell. But anyways, right, you have the tree of life, and out of that from that one cell comes every living thing. I've heard somebody say, yeah, we're related to bananas. And in reality, we are. At some point in history, we have a common ancestor, okay, to a banana. But anyway, so these branches go off, right? You have plants, and you have insects, and then you have more, animals that take place, and you diverge into fish, and so forth and so on, right? So that's the tree of life, okay? What he says that this tree of life is a trade secret, that we don't have evidence for this, right? All we have is the tips, okay? All we have is the tips right out here, okay? All these supposed branches that connect them all together is inference, is imagination. There's no evidence for it, right? Putting it in this form, talking about Darwin's tree of life, okay? So these are the different life forms. These would be the branches that connect one to the other. Do you notice anything in that chart? A lot of white. There is no fossil record of connection between one and the other. There isn't, okay? If you take out all the white, that's what it looks like. All individual life forms, no evidence of one growing from one into the other, okay? So even though they say, oh, his geological record, animals get larger as you go up the thing, but all the basic body types, classifications, are found on the lowest level. They get bigger and more complex as you go up, okay? But the basic body types are there, and there's no evidence in the fossil record of these things. Geology surely does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this, perhaps, is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. This is Darwin talking about the fossil record when he was alive. Okay? The explanation lies, as I believe, in the extreme imperfection of the geological records. In other words, Darwin is saying, yeah, right now the fossil record is not showing the proof of my theory. You can't see it there, right? But the reason why is we've just begun. As time goes by, we'll see more. And the truth is it's gotten worse, not better, right? We haven't found any of it, as Jay Gould mentioned in his statement. We're about 120 years after Darwin, and the knowledge of fossil record has been greatly expanded. We now have 250,000 fossil species, but the situation hasn't changed much. We have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's time. And some of them, as they looked carefully, they realized they were making things up to be transitions when they were not. Okay? So we have fewer examples now, right? All right. Now, why do we have so many fossils? Okay? If you're walking in the woods and see a dead animal, what's going to happen to that dead animal? Huh?
It's going to decay.
It's going to decay, right? Critters are going to eat it. Vulture may come and eat it. Bugs will start eating it. It starts falling apart. It doesn't take long until it falls apart. Okay? But how do we get this? This is like, you see that? That's one fossil thing with all those fish dead. And look at that. Look how detailed that fossil is. You can see the scales. How do you get that to take place? And not only just one or two, but to get millions of fossils. Okay? They have to be buried, and not just if well, I hate to say this, but if your little pet that you had and you go to your backyard and bury it in 3 feet, and you were to go back and dig it up, is it going to be a fossil? No. It's got to be buried a whole lot more than 3 feet. A lot of pressure. It's not easy to make a fossil, and yet we have billions of them. Millions of them. All right? How do you do that if now there was mass catastrophic burial? Okay? Immanuel Velikovsky, the explanation of the origin of fossils by the theory of uniformity, right? We talked about uniformitarianism, and evolution contradicts the fundamental principles of these theories. Nothing took place in the past that does not take place in the present. Today, no fossils are formed, right? So the uniformitarianism says whatever processes we see today is how we predict the past. Well, what are the processes today? Fossils are not made now, right? Okay? There are no fossils being formed now. So if you're going to go even by your own principles, right? It makes no sense that you say that those fossils were buried over time and just lay in the ground. There's no way if those layers took billions of years, right? They had to have been buried and buried quickly, okay? All right. So one of the things that happened after the flood, right? So the scientific theory now is that when it talks about the fountain of deeps, it was probably water that was underneath, also volcanoes. All of a sudden, volcanoes all along the mid-Atlantic ridge started going off. So remember when we had that tsunami out there by the Indian Ocean and the devastation that brought in? Okay, that was from one earthquake. Imagine a whole chain of volcanoes going off in the mid-Atlantic ridge, constantly creating huge earthquakes, bringing water onto the shore. Okay? Then you have the water from above coming down and raining. Right? But one of the things we know about volcanoes today, observable, is that when you have a volcano, it actually cools the temperature of the earth because it puts particles in the air, clouds form, and it shields the sun from warming up. But that's one volcano. Imagine lots of them. And see, one of the things we know in those sedimentary layers is that there's a lot of ash in them. So we know that volcanoes were going off, and lots of volcanoes. Okay? So what happens is you have all this water, but it's warm, right? Because you're sending all this stuff into the air, okay? And so the water is warm, but what's happening in the temperature on the earth, because all the cloud cover over time, is going to cool. So you have a lot of moisture in the air, but that starts cooling, and so what's going to happen, okay? All right? And so... So you have all that water going up into the air, And as it starts cooling, right? Because now you got all this stuff in the air, all the particles, it's starting to shade the sun, but you have lots of moisture. And so what happens is you're going to start getting a lot of rain, a lot of precipitation, but as the temperature cools down, that precipitation turns into snow, and the way you get an ice age, you have to have snow upon snow upon snow upon snow. Okay? Glaciers are getting smaller is because we're still recovering from the ice age of the flood. Okay? They're not getting bigger because there's not as much moisture, we're not as cool as you are following the flood, right? During the flood, it was warm, right? One, because we know that there were a lot of warm plants, okay, before the flood. But two, because of all the volcanoes going off, but once that all settled and you got cloud cover, the temperature came down, you started getting a lot of moisture in the air, you started getting lots of snow, and that's how you get the ice age, huge ice age, okay, that take place, okay? So if evolution was true, what sort of evidence would you expect to find, right? So if evolution was taking place, what evidence would we find, right? A fossil series showing transitions from one species to another, right? Simpler life, okay, in deeper strata. Fewer species in deeper strata, right? Because as you're starting to grow, you get the first life, and then it gets more complex and more complex and more complex, okay? All right? And you see macroevolution happening today. The reality is we don't see any of those things, none of those. That evidence is not there, okay? But if you were expecting creation to be true, what evidence would you find? Lack of transitional species, right? You have stasis, okay, in the fossil record. You have complex life forms in all layers, which is what we see, and more variety in deeper strata, which is exactly what the geological record shows, okay? Now, we do have a challenge, right? So there is a big problem for us. And again, I told you, we don't have all the answers. There's things that we can't have an explanation. Understand, when the Bible is not a scientific book, it's not telling us all the details that happen. We just know pieces of information that we put together, okay? So we don't have an answer to everything, but we have makes the most answer. For example, one of the big problems for evolutionists is how do you have, because the animals get larger as you go up. Right? Same, all the phyla are there, most of them, but as you get up, they get larger. And the lower ones are mostly either sea-dwelling or near the sea-dwelling, okay? And as you get up, you get to land animals, so like dinosaurs and things like that. How does that happen? So they found in this coquina sandstone, which is one of the layers that you find in the Grand Canyon, and they found footprints of some kind of, looks like some kind of reptile animal. And it says, how were those footprints shaped that way? So this gentleman by the name of Leonard Brand, he said, okay, well, let's look. So he got a salamander, and he put it on dry sand and had it walk around dry sand. It did not create those shapes. I mean, you can see, if you look here in some of the close shots, you can see nails. Now, if you're barefoot and you walk on dry sand, does it leave your toe prints there usually? No, it leaves more of a general indentation in dry sand, okay? So then he says, okay, then he took the salamander and he had him walk on wet sand and see the footprints that it left. It didn't quite look like that. And then he says, okay, well, let's put it on a sand that is moist, right? Like super saturated sand, other sands that's more compact but wet, it didn't leave that mark. So then he put water in the tank, but not enough to bury the salamander. So the salamander was scurrying across with water, but going to the sand. That's the kind of footprints it left. Now, why is that important? What does that tell us? That the animals, the water started rising slowly. As it started rising slowly, they're trying to get away from the water. Okay? So the bigger the creature, the more likely it could escape rising water. The smaller this creature, the more likely it would maybe get swallowed up over time. So we have an example here of an animal who there was water trying to get away, right? With some water there, but not covered in water. So what this demonstrates is that we have evidence that water started rising slowly, right? So that's why you would see dinosaurs or larger animals not being in those lower records, because they were able to escape the rising waters, okay, as they started happening. So that would be an example of that.
There's something about the power and grandeur of these vast oceans on planet Earth. Astronomers tell us that there's no other planet we know of that has oceans like this. So where did all this water come from? We can actually find some answers by studying the rocks, the fossil record. And in the fossil record, we find out that Darwin's theory is not particularly supported with those little tiny changes that he predicted over time. Instead, we either find animals that are very similar to animals today, like the shrimp they find in Germany, or animals that are extinct. We don't have them at all anymore. But let's study again the rocks to see if we can learn more about the history of our oceans.
Everybody struggles to explain what is going on with the fossil record. There are certain aspects of it that are very well accommodated by the idea of creation followed by a global flood. So, for example, you see these massive deposits of sedimentary rocks across the continents that look like they were put down by water. And obviously we don't see water all over the continents nowadays. So you could say, well, that's great evidence for the flood, and also it looks as if fossils are commonly, not 100% of the time, but commonly produced under conditions where there's a lot of water involved. They're rapidly buried in floods or a flood of some kind. And then there's this order in the fossil record. You see different kinds of organisms appearing suddenly in the fossil record. So that's a pattern that is exactly the opposite of what Darwinian evolution would predict. Remember, with Darwinism, we need slow, gradual changes over immense periods of time. That pattern is not reflected in the way the fossils are arranged in the fossil record. But there are some patterns that kind of can be consistent, maybe, with the idea of evolution. So, for example, if you believe that there were invertebrate organisms that somehow or other evolved, and then vertebrate organisms, and they got more complex and swam around in the ocean, and then they got out on the dry land, and then on the land they developed some more, and now we have these modern organisms. Actually, you can see a pattern that is kind of like that in the fossil record. So some things look like the flood, other things, wow, they're kind of more, at least more accommodatable by the idea of Darwinian evolution. So how do we deal with that? What we have to do is we have to decide which of the patterns that are there are going to be the ones that decide the direction we're going in. To me, we have a very consistent pattern of massive amounts of water, sudden appearance of fossils, and outside of those physical data that we can observe, we have the Bible that gives a record of these things. And we have a zillion other flood stories that sort of suggest, hey, you know what, maybe this is a historical reality. Nobody can explain all of the details at this point. It was a historical event. None of us were actually there. We can't observe it. Something went on. I personally choose to believe by faith in God's word, but also consistent with what I consider to be the definitive data to believe that there was a global flood. At the same time, I acknowledge there's still a lot to find out there. So we don't know everything. There are still mysteries, which is great. You know, that's what science is really all about, exploring mysteries, coming up with explanations that make sense, sometimes finding out that they really don't make sense, doing more research, and continuing that process. It's a thrilling voyage of discovery.
When we look around in our world today, we can see things that are very sad and difficult to look at. These broken mountains and this disharmony and the fighting of animals. And we say, wait a minute, where did that come from? And we look at the geologic column. And people say, look, you Christians who believe in a recent creation can't believe that. Look at that geologic column. That proves deep time. But the Bible has the story of the flood. And it is that story of the flood which little by little created basic portions of that geologic column. And so the geologic column is not a record, a rock record of how God created over millions of years. It is a rock record of how, with a broken heart, God had to judge because of sinful human beings. So it's a record of judgment, not a record of creation. And so we can show then that God is worthy of worship because He didn't create over millions of years of death, suffering, and so on. And that's the importance of the flood for us today spiritually.
The flood is a very interesting. It has major ramifications, actually, of how we do science as believers, and as far as the geologic column and things like that. But it also, theologically, it's a very troubling event. Probably one of the more troubling events of all Scripture. What happened that caused God to do this? You know, whether you believe God was the one who threw the rocks, quote, and broke up the windows of heaven, or whether God let go of the winds and strife naturally happens because there's a greater controversy going on, a greater issue. Because the issue here is human morality and what humans were doing to the earth that they were given dominion over. And what happened to humanity is, of course, the garden tells us they were deceived, they had fallen, and things got worse until it became so bad it broke God's heart. And the only way God could save the planet was to let evil do what it was going to do and save those who were willing to come into the ark, so to speak, or willing to be saved. And so it's definitely one of probably the saddest chapters in the Old Testament as far as just total, if you want to see a Holocaust, that was the Holocaust in a sense, or the destructive force, the war on planet Earth, so to speak. Everything got changed, everything.
So if the rocks, the fossil record, tells us that at some time in the Earth's past, a worldwide flood destroyed all life on the planet, and if we also believe in a creator God, a God that is a loving creator, why would He send something so severe, something that the Bible calls a strange act? And yet the Bible also says He wanted to save, not destroy. That led to the building of an ark.
right, so I have here some sample of some fossils we want to look at afterwards. Right there is a little trilobite. And this one is big enough that you should be able to make it out. Can you see that one? It's a fish. Yep, yep. So somebody's a little bit harder to tell, but he has a shark tooth, right? Fossilized, just like we have sharks today. Some of these things, like this right here, okay? Can you see what that is? What is it? It's a seashell. If you go to the beach, you will see that nothing has changed. Supposedly this is supposed to be 400 billion years old. All right? But it looks just like you walking on the beach. It looks exactly the same. You know, you've got like nautiluses, okay, and here, can you make what it is? Okay, and what kind of leaf? It's a fern. Just like ferns look like today. Okay. All right. So how big was the ark, just real quickly, right? And God used it to protect life, right? Because people say, oh, there's no way you're going to put every living thing in that ark and survive for a year, okay? Well, the ark was 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high, okay? And what's interesting is that when they study boats, it is like the correct ratio for a stable boat, okay? It had 3 decks with a total of 1.5 million cubic feet of capacity, okay? So if you're going to use railroad cars, okay, it would be around 522 railroad cars that you can fit inside of that ark. Okay, it's huge, right? This is, what about all those animals? How do you get in there, all right? Well, the thing is this, is you don't have to have every single species. All you needed to have is kinds. We know genetically all dogs today come from wolves. All of them, genetically. Okay? Right? Variation, all you needed to have was the wolf kind. All you needed to have was the horse kind. All you needed to have, okay, was all these, example. All you needed to have is the kind, not every single variety needed to be in there. Right? The other thing is, God most likely brought in young animals, right? Because they needed to be able to reproduce once they got the ark. So they needed to be young. So probably they could have been small juveniles which weren't as large. So how do you get a big elephant in there? And maybe it wasn't a big elephant, it was a young elephant. Okay? All right? But when you calculate all of that out and you figured out all those cards, they could have had enough things to put 8,000 types of family animals, 8,000 times, 8,000 kinds, okay? So that will be around 1,600 animals, right? Because they come in 2 roughly, except for the 7, right? And enough to put in food and still have space left over. Okay, so if you ever go to that ark there in Kentucky, they'll have a lot of the details that explain how they could have all been managed and taken care of all through, we could see, okay? So you still have space, over half left over in the ark, okay? Which maybe there were more species that just maybe went extinct over time, who knows? So, and we know what happened. It says that the world was evil, okay? The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thought of his heart was only evil continually, okay? And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved. He was saddened by what had happened, right? But he wanted to fix that, okay? So the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, as I mentioned in the video, God's strange act, because God is a God who is a creator, not a destroyer. And the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills under the whole heavens were covered. And the waters prevailed on the earth for 150 days, covered the whole entire planet. And again, it's not that hard to believe. Why are there so few people in the world? If we humans came out of Africa 1 to 2 million years ago, there should be many more people today. What happened to the human population and the corresponding larger genetic variation? That question is asked by population experts. In other words, if we've been here for millions of years, there should be a whole lot more people. A whole lot more people. Where are they? Okay. Well, what they'll say is that sometime in the past, okay, there was probably a disease or something in the environment that killed off a whole bunch of people. Well, actually, we know that there was an event that killed a whole bunch of people. Unfortunately, destruction that happened. Right? But it doesn't make sense, right? Where are those billions and billions of people? Where are they? Where do they go? Okay, so that caused the population to go down. Okay, Mount Everest, right? Highest mountain. So anybody knows Mount Everest is, in the Psalmist it talks about the flood, and that the waters covered the earth, and then the mountains rose up. Okay, and they hasted away. And what's interesting is if you go to Mount Everest, right, that is granite. So this granite, this metamorphic rock, but all the way at the top is sedimentary rock with fossils on them. Marine fossils at the top of Mount Everest. Now, again, what are we talking about? What happened? Why do you have those foldings? All right, so we know volcanoes are going off because there's ashes found in the sedimentary layer. So, and have you ever seen the picture of the Atlantic, right? You have like a scar that goes right down the middle of the Atlantic, okay? And so what we understand is that all of that ridge was going off, and all the tectonic plate that are happening today, right? That's why you have earthquakes in California, happened during the flood, but they were happening at feet per hour, not, inches per decade, okay? Whatever the rate is. And so that is constantly causing earthquakes, shooting up water into the sky, shooting up lava into the sky, shooting up ashes into the sky, okay? And so these tectonic plates were moving, right? But as you began to, over a period of time, you started settling, getting sedimentary layers and layers and layers and layers, those tectonic plates were still moving. And so have you ever had a rug and you push the rug, right? And the rug doesn't slide. What happens to the rug? It buckles up, right? That's one of the ways we get mountains, right? And that's why you have that sedimentary rock start taking weird shapes, because it got bent before the sediment turned hard into stone over time. And so it created those shapes. Other places like here, the Everest, as they started pushing the mantle, it actually started pushing the whole entire bottom up. But what was on top of that bottom, before the sedimentary, was granite. So as that got pushed off, obviously some time, the stuff got washed off, but that's why still at the tips of these mountains, you find sedimentary rock, okay? And the truth is they don't know how to explain that, okay, all right? Scoffers will come in the last days, walking according to their own lust and saying, where is this promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation, right? Kind of like the uniformitarianists, right? Oh, everything keeps going the way it is, nothing's really changed. Well, yeah, there have been events that change, okay, and taken place. For this willfully forget that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of water and in the water, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water, right? So the evidence is, the evidence of the flood is actually connected to the fact that God is a creator of all things, right? That it was made with water, destroyed by water. Made in water and destroyed by water. Then I saw another angel flying in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach to those who dwell on the earth, saying with a loud voice, fear God and give him glory, for the hour of his judgment has come, and worship him who made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and the springs of water, right? So it's interesting, right? What's critical? That we recognize God as a creator, right? These angels are preaching. It says, fear God, respect God, take God seriously, and give him glory. Why? It says judgment has come, but why? Because he is the one who made all things. Right? And why there's so many scoffers today? Because they're ignoring the evidence. They don't want to see it. Okay? The evidence that's there. And on that day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were open. Right? We talked about, right? Stuff coming up from underneath, and then rain coming up from the sky created the situations. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away. So also it will be with the coming of the Son of Man be. In other words, when we don't want to see the evidence before us, right, we're going to fall into the same trap. And part of the reason for this seminar is to let you know is that the evidence is on our favor for those who believe. The evidence is there. Do we have all the answers? No, right? Don't go out of here saying that we have the explanations for everything. We don't, right? Okay, we can't go back and know exactly what happened in the flood. Okay, we don't know exactly how God did these things, but when you look at it, what makes the most sense? And again, you don't have to be a scientist. What makes the most sense? How do you get life from non-life? Right? How do you have those layers? How do you have, and here's the incredible things. When we talk about Grand Canyon, those layers can span continents. And you find those layers all around the world. You find coal beds all around the world. Okay, so there's no way it's a local flood. Okay? A lot of the layers that are part of the Grand Canyon are layers that are found over the majority of the North American continent. How does that happen in a local flood? See? All right? And so forth and so on. They just span all these distances. Lots of fossils. How do all those fossils were made? How does that take place? How do you have anthropologic evidence that cultures around the world, we're not talking to each other until distant past, have similar stories of the flood? Okay? All of these things only make a logical explanation. All right. So as I mentioned, last time I forgot to do the drawings, so we're going to do 4 drawings today. Okay, 4 drawings today. So what we have is I've got 2 gift cards for the Olive Garden, and I was looking at it. They're $15, so that may buy you an appetizer in this day and age. So if you want a free appetizer, so what we'll do is we'll go back and forth. We'll give a gift card, and then we have Michael Behe's book, Darwin's Black Box, and then we have Lee Strobel's book, The Case for the Creator. Okay, and so we'll go back and forth. We got our wheel of names, and go ahead and spin it. And let's see who our first winner is. It's Joy Rogers. Hey, Joy.
Thank you.
All right. Go ahead and spin it one more time. This time we're going to give Darwin's Black Box. All right, Ted West. All right, so we're back to our gift card. All right, Donna. And our last drawing for today is The Case for the Creator by Lee Strobel. The West family won today. Yeah, look at that. All right, then. So come back again next week, a week from today, and we've got 3 more sessions after this. And again, when you start piling it all together, right, the evidence is really overwhelming. It is clear if you want to see it. Okay. And so, I want to encourage you, for those of you who are believers, make a note of that. Let people know. Research. The information is there. There's lots of books that contain information. I think next Tuesday, we'll be giving out a video. If you were here early and I showed you a small segment, the video that I'm handing out, I believe that segment comes out from that video. So we'll be giving that out. Well, let's have a word of prayer to close. Our gracious and loving Father, the truth is, Lord, is when we look out at nature, your handiwork is there to us to be seen. The incredible marvel of life, the evidence that there was a worldwide flood, that what we learn in the scriptures is true history. So, Lord, help us to have confidence in our faith and help those who are struggling to know that the evidence of your word is around us. And so be with us as we go from here. Bring us back again next week, for we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Don't forget, we have some snacks out there, and there's not many left. There's like 2 cookies left. They're coconut chocolate cookies. They're incredible. So first 2 to get them, be great.